Hi, everybody. So Imogen and I are back to talk about overhead mobility today. Our last chat was all about functional movements. We were talking about how to use functional movements to reduce aches and pains, just general aches and pains. And we thought we would focus on a particular area of interest, which is overhead mobility. We both have a lot of clients who suffer with kind of shoulder issues, neck issues, and Imogen's a bit more of a specialist in the neck area. So we thought we'd talk a little bit more about that, both kind of functional movements, the type of exercises you can do, and why you might want to do that, not only for things like strength training, but just general everyday, again, aches, pains, movements, things that you might have to do using your upper body, particularly through your shoulders. So welcome, Imogen.
Hello.
So as I say, this is kind of certainly the neck area is a bit more your kind of area of specialty, which is good for today's chat. So what we'll kind of maybe discuss is maybe the types of clients that we have, what issues that they have, what kind of concerns they might have in terms of overhead mobility, or the types of aches and pains they might get, and the kind of things that obviously we're going to be recommending for them to do to help to negotiate any pain that they might be experiencing, or restrictions as well, like lack of range of motion, that kind of thing as well. So I'll hand it over to you to start us off today.
Well, I think for me, I don't know about you, like I think those that come in with shoulder issues, or like sort of issues around that sort of shoulder blade and base of the neck, that sort of areas, probably my most common client. And generally it tends to be more of like not so much on the sharper side of pain. It tends to be a lot more of that sort of like constant aches and things like this. Or stiffness, tightness, these types of things are what I tend to see with people. And it can, in terms of the like type of person, it varies. Like it could be someone that's really active, or I find that it's people that are maybe sort of interested in doing some activity, or are semi-active, but they tend to be a lot more sedentary in sort of the day-to-day, so sort of office-based and type, or I have a lot that do a lot of driving and stuff like this. But it all seems to be the same. It's all across that sort of like upper trap, space of the neck, between the shoulder blades, generally is where I find people complain. Or the other area that I tend to find that people complain is that top of the upper arm, around sort of like the deltoid and the attachments for the upper trap there. And essentially in terms of sort of movements and things that people find are either restricted, I often find people are either struggling with bringing arms up sort of through the side and then through the abduction, or it's things generally just in the overhead range. And then not noticing, I quite often get it if those do yoga will go, one arm goes a lot further back than the other, and I don't know why, it just can't get there. Or I often see it with people saying about the fact that they actually lose movement in the neck, and that they can't actually turn the head as far. And that's I find that's relevant for the head and the neck, just because of the general sort of shoulder complex, with the whole relation of where our shoulders and how our shoulders are moving into where our head's going. Because if our head is dropping forward, then shoulders follow, or likewise, if our shoulders and arms are coming forward, then head usually follows. So it's generally that type of thing that I tend to see, particularly when looking and talking about sort of the overhead mobility.
Yeah, no, I'm exactly the same. And again, it's a real variety of people that I see that kind of either, as I say, have restrictions, have pain doing certain movements. It can be anything from your everyday person. I've got a really good example of a recent client that I had. A lady probably in her kind of 60s, and she had suddenly started having real kind of mobility restrictions through her shoulder, and was struggling to do things like put things up in a cupboard, take things out of a cupboard, and doing things that involved levers. So obviously, you know, the longer the lever from the body, so extending the arm and then adding load to that. So let's give an example of picking up a kettle, a hot kettle that's got kind of a load of water in it, and then go to pour a cup of tea. Again, the longer that lever had to be, the more pain she was kind of feeling through there. It can be really actually debilitating stuff sometimes for people in terms of limited range of movement. Things like, particularly for women, if you struggle to get your hands behind your back, doing things like doing your bra up, undoing your bra up, really difficult to do, or putting things like kind of things over the top of your head, t-shirts and jumpers and things like that. And such a kind of sometimes a small, what seems like a really small kind of area or restriction can actually be really affecting people's everyday life, never mind as someone who's experiencing pain in their shoulder when they go and do an overhead press in the gym, for example, which obviously is still, you know, very common. A lot of the time, like you say, it's not always. A lot of the people think it might be something like a rotator cuff type injury, where you've got issues here, which it can be the case, particularly if you are a little bit restricted, and sometimes that is often more related, I find, with my clients certainly, to injury rather than just general kind of lack of range of motion or a bit of a twinge. You know, it tends to be something like they've had a labrum tear or something along those lines, but it is just those simple literal up and down kind of movements. And a lot of the time when doing a bit of a kind of an injury analysis with people on this side of things, what I tend to find is it's not what they think it is in terms of the root cause of this issue. A lot of them think, again, they've got some sort of injury or some sort of damage to the shoulder, for example, or even to the neck area. And actually, it really is just lack of mobility through things like spinal movement, which we've talked about before. So not only spinal movement in terms of, we talked about rotation of the spine, we've talked about the lateral side to side movement of the spine, and then the flexion and then the extension of a spine, but also all of those kind of muscle attachments that we've got around the shoulders, the shoulder blades, yes, going into the kind of rotator cuff area, and then going into your thoracic spine through the middle of your, you know, your back area, where we've just not got enough movement, literal movement through those areas. That is what we describe as kind of functional movements, because they really do help us to kind of function and move in the ways in which we should be moving. But as you described earlier, due to things like sedentary jobs, you know, staying in one position for set periods of time, not having that diversity of movement through different parts of our body, particularly through our shoulders and our upper body throughout the day, really kind of restricts people in terms of, you know, joint mobility, the stretch, if you like, or the kind of the flexibility of things like tendons and ligaments, you know, to move, never mind actual muscles perhaps being overly contracted, being in those set positions for long periods of time. And that is where I find predominantly is the majority of people's issues. It is the absolute lack of mobility and functional movements, regularly done with strengthening of kind of muscles and all of those things that I've just mentioned, combined, that will actually, you know, have the biggest impact on improving whether it's kind of pain or just that range of motion. And I don't know if that's the kind of similar thing that you find with yours as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've talked about it in past videos, haven't we, where like it's the variety, and I think that of movements that's key. And I think the upper body, particularly this area, is probably the best example of where that's most key, because if you think about it in terms of what it's like, that area of the body does, like the neck obviously rotates, it bends, it flexes, it you've got the lateral movement as well. Like there's a lot of movement coming from the neck. If you're talking around like the actual shoulder joint, so that where the shoulder joint meets the scapula, that's quite a shallow joint, so that again there's a lot of rotational movement that happens here, so a lot of mobility. And then because in order to be able to have the movement through sort of head and the arms to be able to sort of interact with the world, again that thoracic spine has a relatively quite a lot of movement compared to the other areas of the spine. And then so there's a lot of range of movement in quite a sort of respect a small space, and we tend to only, like you say, engage with sort of the sort of set certain planes and things. So I think certainly introducing that more movement and sort of the different variety of movements can really have a big effect in getting ranges of movement. So for example, where obviously, like you say, people struggle with that sort of reaching back, that you don't have to gain it through that movement. If it's blocking and you're finding it's uncomfortable, you can catch it from sort of gauging other ones. One of the ones I really like is sort of playing with the sort of the trickster with the body, of like where you've had it either on a desk or against the wall and you're sliding, either squatting down or sliding yourself away, so you're getting the range of movement, but it's coming from more of a hip flexion rather than extension at the shoulder and things like this. Or
100%.
you know, we've said similar ones with like a twist, a hand on the wall, and then you're twisting your torso rather than trying to open that range of the shoulder, but you can still catch those sorts of movements to kind of get and encourage that range of movement through the body. And I think if you play like that and encourage more of the variety, like you say, you certainly do end up with a lot bigger reward. And then I don't know about you, because it's quite a mobile one, strength I find can be helpful if you're not very good at sort of focusing on that sort of like scapular engagement, because essentially that's the bit that's holding everything in, he says, in place, stable and controlled, so that you have all that range of movement. So if you're not sort of confident or know how to engage that properly, then that's probably where the strength is important. But generally, like you say, I think mobility through this area tends to be a big reward.
Yeah, totally. And like you're saying, you know, it's called the shoulder complex for a reason, because it really is quite a complex area, because it has at least kind of 9 kind of individual movements that the shoulder can do, believe it or not. It seems like quite a lot, but different types of movements, like you say, kind of rotational, lateral movements, all different types of movements that this kind of one shoulder area can do. Probably a few more, up to about 12 if we include kind of multifunctional movements where you're including whole arm and full rotations with other movements combined. So, you know, like you say, if we kind of restrict ourselves by doing certain things or holding certain positions for long periods of our life, essentially every day of the week, particularly when we're going to work and sitting at desks and holding certain positions for long periods of time, we might do. So lots of people know that they do this, they round the shoulders forward a little bit, but they will then just go and do that opposite movement. So they might then kind of know that they've got to pull their shoulders back, perhaps squeeze their shoulder blades together a little bit. But there is so much more in terms of movement, isn't there? Like you say, the rotational components, the lateral side to side movements, doing one side and not the other, and then kind of switching it over. There's just so many different ways that part of your, you know, your upper shoulder complex and just kind of your upper back as well can move, again, in combination with neck movements as well. Just the more we can kind of play with movement, the better. And I love when you use that word again, play, earlier, because I know we've talked about it before. It is a case of just being less, particularly when you're in an environment where you're at work or in the gym or, you know, surrounded by other people in particular, less kind of self-conscious about how you're moving, about how you're stretching your body out, you know, doing things that feel like, yes, that you're getting a really good stretch from that, but that you're just moving in a variety of different ways. You know, also not just at the same height, you know, moving up, moving down. I'm not saying you have to do everything at a squat position as well, but, you know, again, sometimes like holding on to something, leaning out sideways as well, doing stretches in different ways. So, you know, doing similar stretches, but again, doing them from different heights and one-sided. As say, I will often kind of, if I'm not doing some particular, very similar to how you described, a bit like doing a child's pose, but on the walls, wall slides, things like that, where you get that release all down the back. If I'm not doing that in between my sets at the gym, then I am kind of doing things like holding on to bars, leaning out, stretching in similar ways, but just doing it on one side and putting my body weight into different positions as well, so that you're kind of feeling the, you know, decompression of certain areas in different ways, because you're holding your body in different ways, or you're allowing the body weight to be kind of controlled, but in different types of movements and different planes of motion. You know, it all just comes down to this whole variety. And again, you don't have to probably even do as much as, you know, I would be describing there, but do more than what you're currently doing, and then just slowly kind of increase over time as well. Anything that you can do that is, you know, going to improve the movement of any part of your body is going to be of benefit. But as I say, we tend to find, particularly with people that have sedentary jobs, or they just don't kind of move too much at all outside of whatever it is that they're doing during the day, that the upper body and the shoulder area and the neck area is where we just have the most issues, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. And I think it's also, like you say, it's because we spend so much time in set positions with this, and even when we're not necessarily working, the things that we tend to engage with tend to be things that mimic the same movement patterns that we've just been doing. Like the upper body, because it has got so much variety in its movement, but we just don't use it. We just don't do activities that require the entire spectrum. So when we're losing that range, then it just gets really restricted and sort of sore and tight, and then that's when like injuries and things, because you're just overusing and things.
Yeah. And actually coming back to thinking about where I was saying about the overhead mobility and putting things in cupboards and using kettles and things like that. Again, some people will say, yeah, but I do, I do overhead mobility because I do put things in cupboards and I do this and I do use the kettle regularly. But again, what you're doing is the same kinds of movements all the time over and over again as part of your natural kind of, lifestyle habits, which is fine. You've got that movement in place. But what other variety is there, within your movements? You tend to find people who work in jobs where they have to work down on things, up high with things, they do have to rotate. These are the people who just don't have any kind of aches, pains.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? When you were saying with the reaching over, and it's like you're still reaching, but chances are you're probably squaring yourself up, like you're not creating that torque through the body to twist to reach for it. Because a lot of the time we're taught not to do this stuff, because they're taught for all of the like square on form, great form and things like this, and it's like there's a place for that. There's certainly to avoid injury, but as a part of that is to actually, like, the body is actually hell a lot robust, especially when it's not under great load. So when it is lifting like little bowls and things like this, like it can cope with these twists and stuff. Like it's just when we're starting to lift like this out of head, or you can tell I'm not a gym person with the weights. When I was like, say a figure, and I was like, I don't know what figure would be a heavy weight. But it's when you're starting to lift sort of like the more relatively heavy weights for you that you then want to pay attention to more of the form and stuff to be efficient there to protect yourself. But for day-to-day movements and things, you can afford that little bit more of, like you say, the word again, play. Like you can be a little bit more obscure in your movement, because it will also build resilience for when things go wrong later, because you've moved in those ranges of movements. It can kind of bounce itself back from them, and avoid the sort of more severe injury by doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the kind of key thing to say about that kind of movement is, everyone's unique. And we could say, oh, once you go past, lifting a particular weight, then yes, you've got to make sure technique for that. Again, that's where kind of strength training kind of comes into it, and knowing what you're doing with that comes into play. But everyone's unique. What is my heavy is not someone else's heavy, and vice versa. So it's you knowing what is excessive load for yourself and what your body is used to, but also a lot of the time those kind of injuries where it's movement with load tend to be spinal, in nature, because we start to then employ kind of lower lumbar spine, back muscles to help with that kind of thing. And so it's not often kind of, upper body, shoulder type stuff. And one of the things that obviously you can learn to do that's going to help with this is just making sure that you also understand the idea of bracing when you are then going to add load to that kind of a movement. So bracing your core muscle, I often think about it. And again, we talk about this when we're doing things like squats and deadlifts and all those big heavy lifts, but also just for the small little lifts as well. I might get someone to kind of lift something up in front of you, not too heavy, a very small kettlebell or a little weight plate, something like that. They lift it up and they'll experience some pain in their back or in their shoulders when they do the lift. Brace, do the same thing again, using your core, using other areas that isn't just those areas where you're perhaps feeling the pain, and then you're kind of taking that pain away from the kind of area that started to dominate, essentially overusage as well, which is a major issue. and just making sure that you kind of employ those as additional techniques when you do have to lift something heavier that is more of a load than what you're used to. But otherwise, in terms of just kind of mobility for weights that you're used to using, you know, there's no kind of restrictions really, are there, you know, with what you could be doing, but just be more playful with it. Do kind of experiment with movement, and we become very kind of trapped in doing the very same kind of movements, even if we feel like we're an active person and we're just moving all the time. You're one of those people, I'm a bit like that, on the go, you know, I don't like to sit down for too long, but I could still have some of these issues if I just moved about my day with still restricted movements and the same kinds of movements all the time, if I didn't have enough variety and diversity in the way in which I do those different things. So I will talk to people about doing different functional movements regularly. So, you know, a classic example for me is I always say to people, you know, I use something like a squat to get down, of course, and I even do things like unload the dishwasher in a squat type position so that I'm not bending my back over, and I'm using a you know, a good technique in terms of if I've got to kind of lift load. But you know, you can use all manner of different kind of movements. And if I was just to always say using that same technique the whole time, again, I'd still be kind of restricting what I do. I might be employing, you know, safety, as it were, in terms of trying to protect my spine and moving in a way that's beneficial in that way. But again, I don't always necessarily want to do it in exactly the same way. I want to move in different ways and do my functional movements, but in different ways as well. You know, it doesn't all have to be the same kind of functional movements, which I think is also good.
I mean, I'm like you with like, I mean, one of the things I do, and it's probably reflective of what gets tight for me when I'm doing this sort of the massage side of things, is I very much like that sort of like modified puppy pose, or sort of that stretching sort of through lat and the posterior shoulder sort of across the back and stuff, because that's an area for me that just gets quite tight, partly for the job, partly just by nature. And bits and pieces of how I move and hold myself. But again, like you, it's not all in the set position that I've talked about, obviously against the wall and doing it again against desks and counters and stuff before. But again, like I can be lazy. Like I quite often will quite happily lay either in bed or on the floor with my arms above my head. And again, it's just that slightly altered position, like especially if you're in bed and you have your arms off the edge, you can have gravity doing the work and you get the load in it that way. You can play with whether your hands up or down, so you're creating different stretches and stuff like this and exploring the movement. Or if you're sort of, like you say, in the door frame, stretching and walking through a door frame, just grabbing hold either side, but the same side, so you're creating the stretch in different places. So you get, it's a good way to get to know your own body as well, isn't it? When you include those different types of functional movements, you kind of get a better understanding of how your body moves, responds to different either stimulus and forces that you put through.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, obviously we are all unique, and so we do need to learn how our body feels, how it moves, and there is no, unless you are doing, you know, as long as you're doing what we would describe as a controlled movement rather than a super quick movement where you are going to perhaps risk injury if you're not really careful, as long as it is a controlled movement, there's no right or wrong when it comes to movement. You know, if you are trying different things, moving your body in lots of different ways, you know, there's no perfect stretch, you know, there's no perfect kind of way to move. If it feels good, if you feel like you're getting a stretch and you're doing a variety of different things, you're moving your body weight in different planes of motion, you're using your muscles, you know, you're stretching out kind of lots of different areas of your body, there really is no, you know, it does not have to be perfect. You know, people will perhaps go into something like a yoga or a Pilates class and think, oh, I just really can't do kind of like perfect, they can't perfectly do like down dog, or I can't do this pose, you know, whatever it might be. But that doesn't matter, you know, again, just keep, you know, do variations of all different types of movements. It's a bit like strength training, you know, there are so many, there's no particular one that is perfect for one person, particularly, you know, how you hold your body, how you're holding your weights. Yes, you want to be safe, and certain techniques, particularly when you go heavy, are important to employ, but actually, you know, doing things like a shoulder press sometimes, you know, having your elbows in at a 45-degree angle is best for some people in terms of their movement, their shoulder complex, and again, any other injuries or issues you've got. Some people can afford to go wider and not cause themselves an injury, and some people just have to bring it in a bit lower, or just, you know, there's lots of different variations. There's no exact right or wrong for some of these things. Sometimes you just have to make sure that you are diverse with your movements. And I think, you know, I know we keep banging on about this and coming back to this time and time again, but diversity is key.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so we'll leave people with that final thought, because I think that's a good one to remember. You know, obviously, I think it's been good to cover overhead mobility in particular. We've got some other areas that we'd like to look at in our next few videos, something a little bit different. But obviously, if anybody ever has any follow-up questions or anything they want to kind of ask us, obviously you can kind of contact us through our socials. So Imogen is IH Soft Tissue Therapy, and I am Proformance. So do kind of get in touch with us, and yeah, we'll be happy to answer your questions. Right, great to chat, Imogen.
Thank you.
See you again next time.
See you later.
Bye.